Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that, but it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolong Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolong is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors.
Tapes from the Dark Side.
Tapes from the Dark Side.
Tapes from the Dark Side
is an awesome new true crime podcast.
What motive could a father have for hurting his own son? What dark secret is Mark Redwine hiding? In Season 1, the host T.Z. Borden investigates the curious case of a missing 13-year-old boy and the father suspected of murder. Please go search Tapes from the Dark Side on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Tapes from the Dark Side.
You should give it a good listen.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we continue our investigation into the murder of Yvonne Layne. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, with my impeccable co-host.
You can't laugh. You know what, everyone? That's going to be the best you're going to get today because Brett cannot get through the words impeccable and Alice without laughing his head off. You can hear him. I should be offended, but this is hilarious.
I'm sorry. I don't know. It's not funny because you are impeccable, Alice.
Clearly, that's not
true.
That
was Bridget's, by the way. Thank you, Bridget, for that very accurate descriptor that absolutely applies to Alice in every way.
Bridget, thank you for saying that unsarcastically. Thanks a lot, Brett.
I don't know what's going on with me today, but I'm glad to be here.
I think we are just happy because you all have gotten us to 2 million listens.
Yay. Yes. Thank you guys so much. That is so awesome. And it's all you, especially those of you who tell your friends and they leave reviews and do all that awesome stuff. I mean, word of mouth is how we advertise this podcast. We don't have any advertising, so it really is all down to you guys, and we really appreciate it, and we hope that the podcast always lives up to your expectations, especially Alice's impeccableness. So, anyway.
Brett, I think we can just be real. I'm beyond not impeccable. Well, I can't even say that sentence right because all I've faced today is getting reprimanded by judges left and right. I am far from impeccable.
Alice had a long day of hearings today, and because of many things that were not her fault. You know, the problem with being a lawyer is you have to stand up there in front of these judges who yell at you for things that you have absolutely no control over. It would be one thing if it was something you did, you know, then you're like, well, yeah, I messed that up, so I got to take a beating. But it is almost never your fault.
Mostly never your fault. Why, counsel? Is it raining outside? I apologize for the weather patterns.
I'm sorry, Your Honor. I will pray about that.
Anyways.
Well, that's why we are so glad to be here tonight, back with you guys, talking about the murder of Yvonne Layne. Fascinating case, a case that is the subject of an entire podcast, Murder in Alliance, hosted by the wonderful Maggie Freeling. Hope you guys have been listening to that. Last episode, we finished up our initial discussion of the timeline. We're going to come back to the timeline a lot as we move through this, because in so many ways, the timeline is absolutely critical to what you think may or may not have happened. Just to remind you, it's been a week, but all of this comes down to whether or not you believe Joe Wilkes' story that David Thorne paid him to kill Yvonne Layne. If you believe that, then David is guilty. If you don't believe it, then David almost absolutely has to be innocent, because the only evidence against David is Joe's story. And maybe innocent is too strong. If Joe's story is not believable enough, then there's no way that David can be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. If you have reasonable doubt about Joe's story, then you have reasonable doubt about David's guilt. That's why this is a really fascinating case in so many ways, because it really all comes down to that. So given that fact, we talked about the timeline last time. We're going to talk about the statements that Joe made. Before we do that, though, I want to talk about a few bits of evidence that do back up what Joe talked about. One of those, we talked about sort of the strange story that Joe tells, that he's taken to the mall. He goes in to buy some gloves and a knife, but he doesn't buy the knife. He only buys the gloves. And he says, well, David was in a hurry. And that seems like a weird thing. And then he says he came back later, went to the same Kmart and bought the knife. And you might ask yourself, is there anything to back that up? Is there anything that supports that? And in fact, there is. During trial, the prosecution called a Kmart loss prevention person, and they testified about the receipts that recorded the purchases that Joe made. And they testified that there were receipts showing that batting gloves were purchased at 1:47 p.m. on March 31st. Now, the other thing you have is you have receipts from the Comfort Inn that have Joe checking in there at 1:46. Now, that may seem like a pretty tight timeline, but the computers at the Comfort Inn were about 15 minutes off, and you actually had someone who testified to this as well. And Joe paid for that Comfort Inn stay with a $100 bill, which is what he said. He said he was given a $100 bill by David. Now, if you back up, David gets off work at 12:30. He buys some fish. He drops him off at his house around 2. So if he picked up Joe between this like fish purchase and dropping the fish off, then you can imagine why Joe is saying that there was a tight timeline. Presumably David was going to meet with his girlfriend. Maybe he had told her he was going to meet her around 2 or after 2, and that's what accounts for this. But in any event, Joe is doing several things right before 2 o'clock, including buying the gloves and getting the room in Comfort Inn. And just to wrap this up, the knife was purchased at 8:12 p.m. that night, which also fits with Joe's story. Joe checked out of the hotel the next morning at 8:35, and this also fits with a call that Joe placed to David's home, which he tells us about. It was a call that was not answered because by that point, David was at work.
That's really interesting, Brett, because, up until this point, it does just kind of sound like it's It just sounds like it's Joe's word. But here you can begin to see why circumstantial evidence is helpful in substantiating a story. We've said this time and time again, circumstantial evidence in the court of law is just as, is weighted the same as direct evidence. And here you can see this is exactly what circumstantial evidence is supposed to do. Standing alone, none of these things really tell any story, but put up against a timeline, you begin to see at least some backing to Joe's timeline. It's not pulled out of thin air.
Right. So then move on to April 1st. Now we know that Joe is calling David. He's not getting an answer because David is at work. Now Joe says that David arrives at the mall around 9 o'clock, asks him if it's done. He says it is. He then takes him back to his home. David's story is that at some point he leaves from work, goes to McDonald's in the AutoZone, orders 3 sausage McMuffins, no eggs, gets the wrong order, has to go back, has to get the rest of the order. So does he have enough time to do this thing that he says he did? According to his boss, who testified at trial, David left his work around 9 or 9:15 on April 1st and came back sometime before 11 with McDonald's. So the testimony that his boss gives fits generally with the timeline that you would need to have for David to leave, pick up Joe, drop him off, go to the McDonald's, get the breakfast, and then bring it back to work. Now, his boss is not the perfect witness. He's kind of like, not sure when he left, but we looked around 9:15, and he was gone, right? So that's where he bases the 9:15, and then he gets back sometime before 11. So it's not a perfect timeline, but it does fit, and interestingly, it fits with both Joe's story and with David's. Okay, so like we said, this all comes down to whether or not you believe Joe's statement. So what exactly does Joe say? If you've listened to Murder and Alliance, you've heard parts of what Joe says. In his statement, we're not going to play it for you here. Like I said, you should go listen to Murder and Alliance and you can hear it. He is very emotional. It feels authentic. Not going to make any bones about it. The first time I heard it, I thought, man, that sounds pretty convincing, but put that aside because people can fake emotion. Let's just look at what he said, and then let's look at the statements he made afterwards and compare them, and you can decide for yourself what you think sounds more believable to you and fits with the timeline we've already talked about and with the testimony of other people who talked about what they heard from Joe. So Joe tells the police that he was in a bad place and that David essentially took advantage of him. He says, quote, "I lost my family. I lost all of my friends. I lost my little brother and sister. I lost everything. I had nothing." Now, we know that Joe had a very difficult childhood. We know that he was estranged from his family. At the time, he'd essentially been couch surfing. He'd been sleeping on different friends' couches in the weeks before the murder. And David had told him that if he did something for him, he would make his life better. And so now I'm just going to read you, this is what Joe said in his statement. "And he told me that he'd make sure I was okay and that I'd stay out of it. And so he picked me up one morning, took me to Alliance Mall at the Comfort Inn, and he had me pay for a room with a $100 bill. Now, that part, as we said, has been confirmed by someone who works at the Comfort Inn, who presumably has no reason to lie. He then sent me to get a knife and some baseball gloves, and we rode around all day, and he told me how to do it. He told me, he's like, just leave the mall about 9:30, just make sure it's done by 10 o'clock, because then he'll be covered, he'll be leaving, he'll have Josh with him, and the cat. And the cat, presumably, is this tiger cub that David took with him to the martial arts class that he was attending."
Yeah, no, this is really interesting because if you hear Joe, like the way he delivers this, I mean, he does not sound calculated. He sounds like a scared young boy confessing everything, and you can even tell like his choice of words. The cat, not the tiger. He's just kind of trying to remember things, and he's so frazzled as he's saying this. Read into it what you want, but he is not sounding like a cold, calculated person giving this statement.
He then says, "I walked from the mall to the house, and I'd taken the gloves and my knife, and I was in some UTU or Nike gear, and I was walking down, and I walked to her house, and the door was unlocked. I opened it, I screamed her name, and I was walking up the first flight of stairs, and she was coming down her bedroom. She was like, "Hey, what are you doing here? I haven't seen you in a long time." I was like, "Oh, David just wanted me to stop by and see how things were." And then we were sitting there talking for about 3 to 5 minutes, and then I did it. And so they sort of, the police ask him to clarify, what did you do? He says, and we were sitting on the couch talking, and I reached over and grabbed her hair, and I cut her neck. The police ask, "Okay, did she get up and try to run?" "Yes, she tried to run out the door." "Which door did she try to run out?" "The big glass door that slides." And then she, "Go ahead, take it easy." Then she asked me why, and I told her David wanted me to. Then she fell on the floor, and I walked down by her and said, "I never did it." And I walked out and ran and threw the knife in one of the side street gutters, and I went back, and I sat up all night at the motel. He gave me the $100 to get the room, and after, if it was done, he gave me $200, and then 3 weeks later, he gave me another $100 for me to get an outfit. So he gave me $300 and $100 to get the room and buy that stuff. So Joe's asked, "Did you tell anybody about this?" And he says the only person that he's told about the murders was Samantha Pegg, and we'll talk about her more later on. So that's the first statement that Joe gives. There are a couple things to point out about this statement, I think. Remember, this is really the ball game here, right? So if you think that David's innocent, then you probably believe that the police coached to this statement, that they've provided Joe the information he needs, and that he then just sort of regurgitates that afterwards. There's one reason it's always difficult with these confessions. If you believe the police are corrupt, then that makes it a little bit harder. Now, you can see sometimes in the interrogation, and we're going to talk about this in a second where this actually happens, where the police give information improperly. And oftentimes, the person who is confessing repeats that to them. And you always wonder, well, is that a true fact, or is that something that they're just saying because the police told them? The problem here is you have to believe that the police beforehand said, this is what you need to say, cover these facts, right? So, one place where maybe you would see that happening is when they say to him, "Did she get up and try to run?" Now, it's important that she did that, right? Because if you've been to the crime scene, if you've looked at the crime scene photos, you know that there's blood all over that glass door. And so the police know that she wasn't killed on the couch. Maybe she was grabbed on the couch. Maybe even he started to cut her throat on the couch. But at some point, she is moving away from him, and that blood is going all over that sliding door. So here, you could see this as this is them sort of nudging him. There's a part of the story you need to tell. You need to tell the part about the sliding glass doors. And sure enough, he says, yes, she tried to run out the door. Then, which door did she try to run out? The big glass door that slides, right? So he has now covered that. Is that an authentic retelling of the story by Joe, or is it evidence that he's being coached and he's now being signaled? And once again, as we walk through this, you're just going to have to decide based on all the evidence what you think's going on there, if you think Joe's being coached or if you don't. So that's the first statement Joe gives. He then gives a second statement the next day. And basically, the police bring him back in, and they have additional questions they want to ask him. And to me, this is interesting because, on the one hand, it demonstrates some of what I was saying, where the police, here they're very clearly trying to get his story straight. They're trying to get him to address missing pieces in his story that might make you think he wasn't really there and he's making this up. But the police are trying to get him to cover those parts, to fix those holes, so that in the future, when he is questioned about this, he can say, yeah, when I gave the first statement, I didn't remember that, but then we talked some more, and I did remember it, and I supplemented my statement, and so, yeah, all that is true, and it's not a hole in my statement. You'll see what I'm talking about here in a second. Now, what's interesting about this is while the police are doing this, Joe does not react the way he should react if he's being coached. So I just gave you an example of when you look at the statement and if you believe he's being coached, you're seeing this sort of cueing happen where, did she run? Oh, yeah, she ran. Did she run out a door? Oh, yeah, the big glass doors. I forgot that. I needed to say that, didn't I? Haha, right? But you're going to see here where the police are asking questions where he does not answer it correctly. And on the one hand, the fact that he doesn't answer it correctly makes you question whether or not he was really there. But on the other hand, it makes you question whether or not he was coached. And so let me walk through some of these because that probably is confusing, and it'll be more clear when I give you some solid examples. So the first one is the police ask him whether he saw or heard a dog. The answer on this needs to be yes, because there was not only the German Shepherd there, but there were the puppies there. And Joe says that he did not hear a dog. Now, you would think if he had been coached in this statement, he would say he heard a dog. On the other hand, you would think if he'd actually been there, he would say yes, because Yvonne had this large German Shepherd. He was also asked if he saw puppies. He said that he did not. Once again, unusual, because if he's being coached, they should have coached him about the puppies, particularly if they're going to ask him about them. And also unusual, because the puppies were clearly there and were right outside that sliding door. In fact, you can see them in photographs from the crime scene, and it's hard to believe that the murderer would not notice that they were there. Now, is it possible he is murdering somebody, so maybe he just doesn't notice the puppies? The puppies are probably a little bit more believable than the big German Shepherd. I would think you would notice that dog. But in any event, he says he doesn't. The statement also includes this sort of strange interlude where Joe says that David dropped him off at a friend's house. And Joe wanted to leave town, but he couldn't because David had, quote, given specific orders to a few of his friends that were hanging around for me not to leave. Now, this is a complete fabrication. There's no way David is like storing Joe with some friends who know that they can't let Joe leave. I mean, if that were true, the police would have found those friends. Those people would have testified. I don't understand what's going on here. I don't know why Joe is adding this, but this is clearly not true. Now, you might think this is something the police have told them that they think that David was doing, but it's a very strange thing, and I can't really explain it.
I mean, it might also be that it sounds like this statement puts David more in control of Joe, right? Joe is the one who pulled the knife across Yvonne's throat. He, so far, is the actor. But if the police are trying to peg this on David, they may want to be coaching Joe to sound like he's being controlled like a puppet by David. And so maybe, I have no idea, but maybe the questions are along the lines of like, did David tell you not to leave? Did he tell you where to go? Did he kind of exert control over you? And maybe Joe just blurted this out.
That's a good point. The other possibility is that this is an example of Joe attempting to distance himself from the crime, even though, as you said, he is the one who pulled that knife across Yvonne's throat. He may want to imply that he was forced to do so, he was threatened to do so. And you see this, one of the most interesting things about some of the confessions in the West Memphis 3 case, and one day we're going to cover that case, but one of the interesting things about Jesse Miskelly's confessions is he always places himself away from the crime, either because he's making it up and so he doesn't want to imply that he's too involved, or he's just distancing himself from a crime he was involved in. And he's always, when he's telling the story, he's watching it happen. He's on the other side of the bank. He's far away. He's not really involved in the murders. He's just there, right? And this could also be sort of an example of that, where Joe is trying to just distance himself from this. So he sort of made up this conspiracy where there are all these people who are forcing him to go through with this, and he didn't really have a choice.
I don't think there is a single, Brett, I think this is your experience as well, but I don't think I've interviewed a single person, whether they are a target subject of my investigation, a, defendant, or just a complete innocent bystander witness. I don't think I've spoken to a single person in my career who hasn't told me a story with at least some lies interspersed. Now, lies might be a little bit dramatic way of explaining it, but certainly shades of untruth are told to me, even when it doesn't matter at all. And so I say that because it is not black and white. It's not Joe is lying or Joe is not. In almost every single person I've ever interviewed, someone is telling parts of the truth and parts of the not truth to me, whether they think it helps them or not. I don't know what it is. It's human psychology wanting to distance themselves or to tell a story that puts themselves in the best light. So keep that in mind as you listen and dissect Joe's statements.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It's one of our rules that we started off this podcast with, that just because someone tells a lie doesn't mean they're a liar. It is so true in these confessions. And you so often see people, they want to find a lie and decide that, well, they lied there, so the whole thing must be a lie. And that is just often not the case. It is sometimes, but it's often not the case, like Alice said. And minimization is a huge one. Basically, everybody does it. If you are ever interviewed, you are always going to put yourself in the absolute best light you can, even if you don't realize you're doing it. Like Alice said, I think sometimes it's almost subconscious that people, they just want to appear less involved. They want to be the good guy. They always want to be the good guy, right? So even if it's just sort of overstating their reluctance to be involved in something, or overstating what they did to try and stop it from happening, or anything like that. And I think that's 100% true. And it seems like that's kind of what Joe is doing here.
Shopify is a platform built for growth, whether you're just starting out or already running a thriving business. From managing inventory to creating a seamless checkout experience, Shopify is designed to handle it all. And it doesn't stop there. Shopify helps you sell everywhere your customers are, online or in person. It's the ultimate tool for turning big dreams into big wins. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/OPP.
The other thing that happens in the second interview that doesn't really happen in the first, if you think Joe was coached in the first, it happened before the statement began. In the second interview, the police commit what is essentially the cardinal sin of asking a leading question, a just directly leading question, where they say, "Did you wipe the knife off on a pillowcase?" And the reason they're asking him this is because they have evidence that somebody wiped the knife off on the pillowcase. So they want Joe to say, "Yes, I did that." He says, "I think I did," which is totally him just saying that because they asked the question. I mean, this is, to me, the clearest example of Joe giving them what they want because they've made it very clear that this happened, and so he is confirming it for them.
And by the way, the reason leading questions are not allowed, besides that it's giving facts that may be unknown to the person you're asking questions to, is because while Brett just said that human nature wants to minimize your own role in anything bad, it is also human nature to want to agree with others and to be a pleaser, right? All of us actually, because it's good social cues to agree with others. That's why when someone's talking, you nod along, whether or not you agree with them. It's kind of just social cues. And so leading questions have that advantage. When you're asking a leading question, generally a listener of a question wants to make you feel like you are part of the conversation. And the best way to make someone feel like they're part of the conversation is by agreeing with them. And that's kind of what's happening here. I think I did, not I did. Just, it's possible. We're having a conversation. You're giving me something. I want to give something back. Except that's not how the court of law works, and that's not how interviews work. We know that. That's why leading questions are typically not allowed.
And interviews are so fraught with danger, particularly when you have someone who's confessing. We know, false confessions happen, and interrogations can lead to people giving false information and false confessions. Bob Ruff on his podcast, Truth and Justice, does a lot of discussion about this, about how these false confessions happen and how different types of interrogation techniques can really lead to them. This is just a very sort of bald-faced example of giving someone the information. Like Alice said, they're trying to be helpful, they're trying to be agreeable. By this point, second day, they've got Joe feeling like he's on the team, right? They're all in this together. And since they're all in this together, he needs to help them, right? So it's a really dangerous situation, and you can see how that can be problematic. At the time, it's very tempting to ask Joe a question like this because you want him to say yes, because that ticks off a box, and now you can say, "Oh yeah, good. Now we nailed that down," right? The problem is, long term, it's going to lead to doubt, because anybody who looks at this is going to say, "Did he really? Or did you tell him he did?" Now, you did it through a question, but you told him he did, and you can see how that's a problem. The other thing Joe does is he contradicts the amount of money he was given. Remember the day before, he said he was given a $100 bill, $200 the next day, and then another 100 or two a few weeks later. In this statement, he gives what seems to be his statement that he's going to stick to, which was he got the $100 bill at first and then the $200 later on, at which point he bought the outfit.
So those were the statements that Joe gave to police in advance of trial. Now there's Joe's testimony at trial. Let me just note this real quick. Even if someone's confessed before, they have to then come into court and be subject to cross-examination and give their testimony there. And that's because of the constitutional right to confront your accuser. But what happens is everything you said previously is written up in a report or it's, say, grand jury testimony. That's all fodder for impeachment. So though that doesn't come in as evidence of what you've previously said, if you say something in contradiction to what you said previously, then the other side can use it as impeachment. So let's move into Joe's testimony at trial. The prosecution begins by building up the connection Joe has with David. They ask Joe if he ever owned a car. Now, this might not seem relevant except for the fact that he did, and it was one that David bought him. In fact, Joe had known David since he was 14 years old. Joe had met David through shoot fighting, a kind of martial arts that David was involved in. Joe described David as the big brother he never had but always wanted. This is very interesting because it's one thing to just be someone's friend. It's a whole nother thing for you to buy a car for a friend. That's a much closer relationship. And you may be asking, what did Joe owe David for such a big purchase?
Yeah, and it's another example of the prosecution recognizes that it's a little bit of a weakness that he didn't get that much money. The average person is not going to murder someone under any circumstances. They're certainly not going to do it for $200. But by doing this, they're sort of laying the foundation of, no, this is more than that. This is a deep relationship where, Joe probably would have done this for David for free because he was, his big brother.
And he's given him things in the past that he's indebted to him, more so than he could ever pay him back with what he owned in life. Now, Joe testified that he'd met Yvonne Layne 2 or 3 times. He'd been with David when he went to pick up his son at Yvonne's home. The second time, Joe stayed the night at Yvonne's house. He and David had gone over to her home. Joe slept on the downstairs couch while David and Yvonne hooked up. Joe had gone over to Yvonne's house one other time to say hello. At that time, her boyfriend Eric had been home. Eric is the father of several of Yvonne's children and was in and out of jail. He was in jail at the time of Yvonne's murder. Otherwise, he would have been also another suspect. Now, this testimony here is very interesting because what you're seeing is that the only connection Joe has with Yvonne is through David. And it's relatively close. It has Joe being in Yvonne's home multiple times. And that's important because part of Joe's testimony as to why he was allowed to go into Yvonne's home, why there was no forced entry sign, is because she's already let him into her home multiple times. It would, even if they're not close, it would not be strange for him to be in Yvonne's home. So I think this piece of testimony is very interesting for the prosecution. Now, although much of Joe's statement to the police is consistent with his testimony, the number of times he went to Yvonne's house is a pretty big discrepancy. In his initial statement to the police, Joe said that he'd only been there once with David to pick up Brandon, David's son. But Eric was there, and Joe got into an argument with him that almost came to blows.
Yeah, and that's just a very different statement. I mean, to me, it's weird that he would not remember the number of times he had been over to Yvonne's house in that first statement. I mean, that's what you have to believe, is that he sort of conflates these incidents where he went over there once and Eric was there, and he went over there once with David to pick up Brandon, and he sort of just tied them all together in his initial statement. To me, I think that's weird because I feel like that's a pretty important fact, that he gets wrong. And then by the time of trial, it's much more convenient. And Alice just explained to you why this is important. The number of times he's been there, the fact he'd always been there with David, the fact that Yvonne would not have been surprised to see him there. This initial statement to the police is different. It doesn't have that same strength. And so it is weird to me that those statements would be different. And that's certainly something, if you were cross-examining him, you would pick up on. And the defense does make a point of this in their cross-examination.
But also think about Joe's motivation for his initial statement saying he'd only been to Yvonne's house once. That's minimization. If he's saying basically, I barely know this girl. I had no reason to kill her. The only reason I did it is because David told me to. David's the one who's close to her. He was in love with her at one point. They have a child together. Me, I'm just some schlup who showed up there one time. I barely know this girl. And I'm not an evil person for killing her. So you can kind of see the motivation in the first initial statement as to why he would only say he'd been there once, if in fact he'd been there multiple times. Now, Joe testified that David told him he didn't want to pay child support to Yvonne. At some point, he told Joe he, quote, wanted Yvonne out of the picture, that David wanted her dead so that he could have his son all to himself. David told Joe that Joe could have a better life if Joe killed Yvonne for David. Initially, David wanted Joe to shoot Yvonne, but he decided that would be too loud and said Joe should cut her throat instead. The point of this part of his testimony is to give motivation to David. Remember, the defense is going to come and say David has this trust fund, he has a good job, he has plenty of money. Money is of no consequence here. It's not worth killing Yvonne over some child support that is essentially no matter to him. And Joe here is explaining that it goes beyond just the monetary value. It goes deeper. It's that he wants his son to himself and doesn't want Yvonne there anymore.
And I think, honestly, maybe one of the weakest arguments that has been made by people who think that David is innocent is that he would not kill Yvonne over child support because he had plenty of money. And you just see this all the time. There's lots of people who have plenty of money who don't want to pay child support. There's lots of people who are wealthy, well off, who absolutely could afford to pay child support, but they don't want to give their money, to that woman. They don't want to give money to the person that they have a bad relationship with. Now, everybody says that David had a good relationship with Yvonne, and that's a better argument to me. But the argument of, he could have paid the child support, no big deal, I don't buy that. I can totally see this as being a reason that David would want to kill Yvonne. And the other thing about this that's interesting, this last little piece of information, it's just a little bit of color that adds credence to Joe's story. It's this little extra detail that makes it feel more real. This notion that David had initially thought he should shoot Yvonne, but then said, oh no, that'll be too loud. You should cut her throat instead. I mean, just that little detail is one that clearly the prosecution wants him to tell this story, this part of the story, because it makes it seem more real. Joe also testified about the night of the murder. In his testimony, sticks pretty close to the story we've told you. The plan was for Joe to get a room at the Carnation Inn and then walk to Yvonne's house. David wanted the murder completed by 10 p.m. That way, David has a rock-solid alibi, as he'll be at his martial arts class with his tiger at the time. So on cross-examination, the defense attempts to poke some holes into this story. They pointed out that Joe had no living expenses at the time. He was living with friends, and that he had made some money working various odd jobs. And he also had got an insurance payment from his car, the car we talked about earlier. He'd actually wrecked it recently. That's why he didn't have a car. It's because he'd wrecked it, and he'd got an insurance payment. And the idea was, this $100 bill is not as weird as it sounds. People, and we're going to talk about more of the testimony, but there's this notion that Joe just didn't have any money, so where would he have gotten a $100 bill? To me, this is pretty powerful from the defense, because it's like, look, it wasn't like he didn't have any money ever. He came up with money every now and then. Every now and then he would have had money. And everything he would have been doing, he would have been paid in cash. Joe's working odd jobs. He's not, checks not being direct deposited into his savings account. I doubt he had one. So he would have had cash, and you can imagine that's where this $100 bill came from. And then the prosecution and the police just kind of retcon that. Oh, that $100 wasn't from the work you were doing. That was from David. That's how you had that $100 bill. He was also asked whether or not he'd ever seen David take drugs. And he said that he knew that David also took cocaine and LSD. And I just don't know that this is true. I haven't really seen any evidence of David using cocaine and LSD, but this is important, as we talked about last time, because otherwise, where would he come up with this cocaine and LSD that he had supposedly given to David? So to me, this is an important part of the testimony that I hope can be drilled down to more in the investigation. David's lawyer talks about this confession. He gets into whether or not Joe was coached. He asked him how long he'd been talking to the police before they turned on the recorder. And he said about half an hour. And during that discussion, he said that the police had told him that David had asked for immunity and was going to testify against him. Now, this is important, right? Because why would Joe lie? Why would he fabricate this statement? Well, the defense is clearly trying to say the reason he fabricated it was because the police had told him it's either you or him. He's over here negotiating an immunity statement. He's going to testify against you. So do you want to go down for this, or do you want to tell us what happened? Giving Joe this incentive to lie and to feel like he's been betrayed, right? David, his big brother, the person he could depend on, the most important person in his life, is in the other room getting ready to send Joe, to the gas chamber or whatever they use in Ohio. And that's a huge blow to Joe's psyche.
And Brett, that comes to a good point. Let's say that Joe's telling the truth, that police actually told him that David was, asking for immunity and going to testify. Clearly, we know that was not the case. David was not down the hall. He was not asking for immunity. So this is a lie. Now, let's talk about that. Is it okay for the police to lie in order to get a confession or during an interview?
It absolutely is. The police can lie when they're interrogating someone.
And the reason here is you're testing different bounds, right? But they can't coerce you. They can't punch you and push you up against the corner and choke you until you say you did it. But they can lie in order to, bend the truth, kind of shake your confidence as to what's going on. And here, if he thinks his friend is no longer his friend, that shouldn't change the truth, that the truth is that they had nothing to do with the murder.
And those of you who've seen The Wire, there's that famous scene in The Wire where they tell the guy they're going to hook him up to a lie detector test, but it's just a copier. And it's like they write lie on a piece of paper, and then every time he answers a question, they hit copy, and it spits out a piece of paper that says lie. And then he's like, oh, you got me, and he admits it, right? It's like that. I mean, the police can do that. And like Alice said, it shouldn't change what you're going to say, but there's the obvious danger, particularly in a situation like this, that it is going to. And this is what a lot of people have pointed to. And they said, look, there's a reason he did this. He had no other choice. Everything in his life was gone, and now David was gone too. And it was either take the fall for something David did, or make up this lie where David is involved, and so he chose to do that. Also in cross-examination, the defense got Joe to admit that the police did tell him a lot of the information about the crime scene, information that would be useful in his confession. They pointed out that it was the police, not Joe, who first said that he had grabbed Yvonne's hair. This is important because the whole idea is Yvonne turns away, he grabs her hair, he pulls it back, thus exposing her neck, and then he cuts her throat. And when you read the statement, that is 100% true. He's talking about cutting her throat, and the police officer says, you grabbed her hair and you pulled it pretty hard, didn't you? And he's like, yeah, I did. And it's stuff like that, and stuff about the door and wiping the knife off on the pillowcase. I mean, these are weaknesses in the statement itself that the defense is exploiting. They also point out this whole story about drugs and the LSD and the cocaine. He didn't mention that in either of the first two statements. This is sort of a new piece of information that he's coming up with that was never mentioned before. And if your first statement was true, Why didn't you mention that? The same thing, Joe spending the night at Yvonne's house. We talked about this. These multiple trips to her home, not in the first statements. And now Joe's saying, oh, he was over there all the time. And look, counsel pointed out these contradictions and did a pretty good job with it. This turns out to be a problem for David long term, because eventually he's going to make a ineffective assistance of counsel claim against his lawyer. And there's lots of reasons to think his counsel might have been ineffective. He was drunk a lot. In fact, he had a real problem with alcohol to the extent that he would eventually die because he was drunk and he got locked outside of his home and he froze to death because he couldn't figure out how to get back in. And that's a problem. And obviously you want your lawyer to not be drunk. You want them to be sharp and on point. But unfortunately for David, the standard is you don't get into that. It's not like a subjective standard. It's an objective standard. So did your lawyer do a good job in this kind of cross-examination, pointing out flaws, really sort of digging into the statement? It's the kind of thing that a court's going to look at and say, yeah, he did a good job. He might have been a drunk. He might have been an alcoholic. He might have had a huge problem with alcohol to the point where, he's showing up in the same rumpled suit every day and looks like he hadn't been sleeping, which apparently is true. And that was happening. But his representation, nevertheless, is sufficient that David's constitutional rights were not violated.
I know a lot of you are going to find that very seemingly unfair, but that is the standard, because everyone a part of it is there isn't a pro se rule that, if you've had one drink, you're ineffective, 2 drinks, 3 drinks, obviously, Brett, 1 drink with me versus 1 drink with you, we're going to act very differently, right? I just can't hold alcohol as good as you because you have a greater body mass. And so that's why you have to turn to whether they were effective as counsel here. And some people are functioning alcoholics. I'm not saying he necessarily is here, but he does ask the right questions and he points out the inconsistencies in Joe's testimony.
There's a great story from the founding period of the United States, and I think illustrates this a little bit. So one of the founding fathers, I forget which one it was, but he was a lawyer. A lot of them were lawyers. For those of you in other countries, we call the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution the founding fathers. And so this was one of those people. And he was a lawyer, and he was a very good lawyer, but he also was an alcoholic, and he drank a lot. And at some point, someone hired him to represent them in a case, and it was a very important case, and he needed it because he was down on his luck as far as money goes. But they said, you can represent me, and I will pay you handsomely, but you have to promise not to drink during the trial. And he's like, okay, I won't drink during the trial. And so the trial starts. He hasn't been drinking. He's doing exactly what he said he would do. The trial starts, and the morning of the trial, the opening statements, initial witnesses, he's terrible. He's just awful. He's doing a horrible job. He's like shaking. He can't get past the fact he hasn't had a drink. He can't think clearly. They break for lunch, and his client's like, man, you got to get it together. This is going horribly. You got to get it together. And so he leaves, and he's like, oh man, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And he goes to a tavern, and he orders a loaf of bread and a bottle of whiskey. And he takes the bread and he takes the whiskey and he pours the whiskey across the bread so that the bread like soaks up the whiskey. And then he eats the bread. And in his mind, he's not taking a drink. He's just eating the bread. But now he's got the alcohol and he feels like himself. And he goes back in and he kills it in the afternoon and they win the case. And the guy's like, oh, I'm so happy. You did such a great job. And I think that's kind of like what you have going on here. If the lawyer is doing a good job, if he is representing you well, even if he's doing something like that you wouldn't want, sort of objectively speaking, when the court looks at the cold record, and that's all they're looking at, right? I mean, they're just looking at the transcript and reading the transcript. Did you ask the questions? Did you put in the right evidence or whatever? They're going to say he was sufficient.
So after this trial, David is convicted. And even though Joe testified for the prosecution, Joe is also convicted. He also serves time. Now, while Joe is serving time and David is also serving time, Joe actually recants his story. And this is in 2002. And so David's attorneys file post-conviction relief motions, and as part of that, they depose Joe. And in a deposition, Joe testified that he saw David that day when he brought the tiger cub over to show the Enochs. David had taken Joe to the Carnation Inn because Joe had rented a room where he wanted to have a party. Joe said he paid for the room with some money from work he'd done, and Joe said he ran around the mall trying to drum up interest in his party. He ran into 3 people who said they'd come to his party, but they never did. He also bought the knife to add to his knife collection that night. At some point, the mall closed, and Joe went over to Yvonne's house. Now, Yvonne was sleeping, but woke up when Joe entered the house. They talked for a few minutes, and she told him she was expecting someone and that he should come back later. Joe claimed he had gone to see her to see if she wanted to come to his party. Joe said he'd been to her house 4 or 5 times with David. Joe went to McDonald's for a while, and Joe said when he came back, Yvonne was dead. He claimed he checked on the boys to make sure they were okay, and then he left. Joe went back to the hotel, stopping along the way to call Darren Rohr from a payphone. Joe had the knife he'd bought with him and decided to get rid of it lest he be implicated in Yvonne's murder. Joe said that Rohr came and picked him up at the hotel. So you can see this is vastly different from his previous statements to the police and obviously what he testified to in court that led to David's conviction.
And let's just walk through this, because there are things about this statement that seem a little strange to me, right? So he's recanting. He's now saying none of this happened. And if that's true, then something like what he's telling us now has to have happened, right? Because we have to account for all the strange things he did that night that led you to believe that he may have killed Yvonne Layne. So let's start with why he was at the Carnation Inn. He's now saying we wanted to have a party, and that's why he rented the room. I've been to hotel parties before. People do this. You know, they rent rooms, everybody comes to the room, they hang out, they drink, they leave, right? So he says that's what he was doing. Strangely, he doesn't seem to, when he decided to do this and spend a fairly significant amount of money, especially for him, to rent this room, he didn't have anybody who was coming to the party. He rents the room first, and then he's trying to sort of drum up people to come. He says he talks to 3 people who said they would come, but, you know, they didn't show up. Now, he does not account for his conversation with Chris and Rose that we talked about yesterday. Now, maybe those were some people he talked to about coming to the party. Maybe what he's trying to say is they're telling lies about me. What I really talked to him about was coming to this party. He says he has this knife collection. He says he bought the knife for that.
I mean, it's interesting that he rents a room to have a party where no one else is invited in advance of renting the room. And then he takes an extra trip to go to Walmart to not buy beer or food for the party, but to buy a knife for his knife collection that he can buy any other day of the year on a night that he's not paying for a room in order to have a party.
It's a good point. There's no indication he ever bought anything for this party. I mean, he's trying to get people to come to the party, but he's...
You know what makes people come to a party? Alcohol.
And the other thing, David, to my knowledge, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong about this, David never said, I drove Joe to the mall. He was going to have this party. You would think David would have said that from the very beginning. He would have been like, yeah, I saw Joe that day, and yeah, I dropped him off at the mall, but it was because he was going to have this party. And David never says that. In fact, David never says he dropped him off at the mall. He says he just took him to where he was staying, and that's it. So I don't understand why David would never have told that piece of information if it were true. Now, this Darren Rohr guy, I can't find anything about him. I don't know who he is or whether he has said that he talked to Joe that night. If he exists, it's possible he does. I'll try and find something on that, but up to this point, I have not been able to find anything.
And, you know, what's really interesting is it's getting late, right? The party, maybe it's going to be an all-night rager, but by the time he leaves the a hotel in order to walk 3 miles to Yvonne's house. It's already, 9 o'clock, 9:30? It's late and no one's at his party yet. It's going to take an hour for him to walk all the way to Yvonne's house to invite one person, because Yvonne, has children, so presumably she would just leave her children asleep at home and come with him back to the hotel, maybe call her friends along the way. But of all the people he knows, why didn't he just pick up the phone and call Yvonne to invite her to the party instead of walking 3, maybe 6 miles round trip to get her to come to a party that at this point, by the time she would come, it would be close to 11 or midnight?
Totally insane, right? I mean, this part of the story is another part that just doesn't make any sense. It would make a lot more sense if Joe just said, I didn't see her that night. I was, at the hotel the whole time. I was disappointed because nobody showed up for my party and I just went to sleep, but I didn't see her, But instead, he's putting himself at the crime scene and he's like, oh yeah, I walked that 3 miles to Yvonne's house to invite her to this party where she might well just say no. Then there's this weird thing about Yvonne telling him, well, somebody's coming by. Can you come back later? And okay, now that's convenient for Joe because presumably that's the person who committed the murder. But now he's going to go hang out at the McDonald's for a little while he waits on her.
But why would he do that why would he go back if the only purpose of going to her house was to invite her to a party? Why would you then wait, another hour to see if one person would come to your party? What if those other 3 people you invited came to your party? You're 3 miles away.
And somebody he doesn't know that well, right? Now you notice the number of times he says he has been there has increased yet again. So it started at 1, by trial it was 3, now it's 5 times he's been over there, but he's saying, oh, I just, I went by to invite her to a party. It doesn't make any sense. It's a very strange story to me. I gotta say, just on the surface of it, his story that he told at trial makes a lot more sense to me than the story he's telling now. Now, spoiler alert, this will not be the last story he tells. Like his story is going to change more after this.
Now let's finish up this particular testimony, though. Joe said that during the interrogation, the police told him everything that happened. They told him that David was going to turn on Joe and that David had asked for immunity. Joe said that the police coerced his friend Samantha into saying that he had confessed to her. Joe said he did not take acid or cocaine that day. Now, in 2003, Joe would testify in a post-conviction hearing on David's behalf. His testimony was essentially the same as his deposition the previous year. He said David did it, and because he was scared and the police gave him all the details, that's why he said what he said at David's trial. Again, this is so interesting because the actual real story, or if you wanted to recant, would just be to take yourself out of the equation completely. Why put yourself at the murder scene around the time of the crime? And by the way, would it not be so weird for you to have just spoken with someone, they tell you to come back, you come back, and they're dead, and you know they have children, and you tell nobody? What if that person comes back to kill the children?
Yeah, and he says he checked on them, but they're fine. And this accounts for his, whether or not, if you believe that his footprints are at the scene, we'll talk about that when we get into some of the evidence. But if you believe that, it accounts for that, right? Because, oh yeah, I walked around because I was checking on the kids. And that's how I knew some of the details of the scene, because I was there. And it's very weird. It's also weird that he had the knife with him, right? Like he explains why he knew where that knife was, because he had it with him. He'd bought it for his knife collection. He carried it there. And he decided he needed to get rid of that knife because the police might try and tie it to the murder, as they eventually did. And so he threw it in that drain where, near the McDonald's. Accounts for why the knife's there, right? It's a better theory than the police planted the knife there, but very weird, very strange thing for him to do if that were true. Now, look, I get it. If it is true, this would be a really shocking experience, and I can imagine you doing all sorts of dumb things after finding someone dead, but so little of it really makes sense. And I think, Alice is right. And at the end of the day, he's lying. And we know he's lying because the story has changed yet again. Now, it did not change at his post-conviction hearing. He tells basically the same story. But since then, it has changed. If you've seen the Reasonable Doubt episode on Investigation and Discovery, with which I had a lot of problems with that episode, there are a lot of things I didn't like about it. I got blocked by the Reasonable Doubt Twitter account for asking them questions because apparently you can't ask questions when you're talking about Reasonable Doubt. But one thing that was interesting is Joe tells a different story in that episode. And the story he tells in the episode rings much, much more true to me in a lot of ways. And that's that he went over to Yvonne's house, not for a party, not to invite her to a party, but to have sex with her, because he knew that she was a sex worker and he wanted to sleep with her, and he was going to invite her to come back to the Comfort Inn with him, and that's when she was killed. Now, he didn't do it. Still says he didn't do it, but when he got there, she was dead. And that makes a lot more sense to me than this initial story he told, though the fact that he is telling it so much later, why he didn't tell this story in 2002, if it's true, that I don't know the answer to.
I know. This reminds me of the Amityville case and Butch's story, how it changes so many times. DeFeo. Butch DeFeo's story changed so many times over decades, and how we will never probably know the truth. I think something along those lines is here with Joe.
And, it's such a problem for David, right? If David's innocent, this is a huge problem for him, because the more Joe lies, the less believable he is. And the more it seems like he's just making something up to get him and David out of jail. And it's just a huge problem, even if it's true, right? Like, even if it's true, like, even if that's the absolute truth is David didn't take him to the mall. He went to the mall on his own to get that room. And he certainly wouldn't tell David about it because he wants to sleep with David's girlfriend, right? Now, by 2002, I don't know why he's trying to protect David. He should just tell the story, just tell the truth. But it's a problem. It's just a problem that the story keeps changing. And it's a big problem, because if it's true that Joe did that he actually was there, that makes it so much harder to prove that they're both innocent. Because if Joe's there, then his footprints or his DNA, if that's found there, everybody's going to say, well, this is proof he did it. And he's trying to say, no, I was there for these other reasons. And man, that's going to be that's a tough hill to climb if Joe is now, today, telling the truth. So when you're trying to decide whether or not Joe's telling the truth now or whether he was telling the truth in the beginning, as we said before, the things happening outside of his statement, that's what's going to matter. That's how you're going to know. One of the most important things is this Samantha Pegg person. So Joe says in his initial statement, he's asked, did you tell anybody? And he says Samantha Pegg. And the police talked to her. They were friends, best friends, possibly romantically involved. It's a little unclear exactly what their relationship was. And Joe says to the police during the initial interview that she was the only person that he had spoken to about the crime. So the police then go and interview Sam. And Sam told police that she was at a party at the end of June. So this is a couple months after the murder, right before Joe gets arrested. And she ran into Joe at this party, and Joe seemed upset. And Sam, knowing him as well as she did, confronted him about it. And Joe said that he needed to talk to her. And this is what she said. Joe goes, I need to talk to you. And I said, what's wrong? And he goes, can we go downstairs? And I said, yeah. And so we went downstairs, and he goes, my trainer, Dave? And he's calling him his trainer because in addition to everything else, David is teaching him martial arts. And I was like, well, I heard you talk about him. He goes, well, he had me kill his ex-wife. And I asked him why. And he said, because he wanted custody of his kids. And I said, well, did you do it? And he goes, yeah. I was like, okay. I was like, it's done and over with. Now, Sam didn't believe Joe at the time. Not until he was arrested for murder. She'd never met David, but she had heard Joe talk about him all the time. And Joe told her that David had him kill Yvonne to avoid paying child support, and that she thought Joe told her that he got paid about $100 to do this. Now, according to Joe, Sam would later write a letter to him saying that the police had coerced her into implicating Joe. Unfortunately for Joe, he said he threw that letter away. Why he would do that, I don't know. Now, interestingly, Sam had counsel during this discussion. Her lawyer was with her when she talked to the police. So it would be surprising if the police thought they could get away with harassing her or intimidating her or telling her what to say, given that her lawyer was there with her.
Yeah, the police don't really have any reason to coerce her. They don't know what she's going to say, and they already have Joe confessing to them. It's not like they have to corroborate his story with Samantha. So it doesn't really make sense for them to pull out the big guns with Samantha to coerce her into it. And it just seems too convenient for her to tell him in a letter that she was coerced and he threw it away. If in fact that were the truth, Sam could recant at any time. She's allowed to recant just like Joe did, but I don't believe she has.
And the timing is off. You're absolutely right about that. The prosecution, brings this up during Joe's deposition testimony because it was Joe who told the police about Samantha. They didn't know about her before that. They asked him in that first interview if he told anybody, and he says her. So then they go talk to her. So, yeah, the timing is strange. Like, why would they need to coerce her if Joe's already told them that she can corroborate what he's telling them during this interrogation?
Right. And it's interesting because Sam doesn't know David, so she has no reason to protect him or throw him under the bus, right? She's only ever heard Joe talk about David or Dave. She kind of has no dog in the fight with respect to David. So much so that she doesn't even believe him, believe Joe, when he says that he's killed someone for David. And so this testimony actually, strikes me as very believable.
This is incredibly powerful testimony. We're going to come back to it later when we talk about this as we're sort of walking through this whole thing. This is very powerful because of everybody involved in this. This person seems like they have the least reason to lie. And this is a very damning piece of testimony against Joe. And, also against David.
Remember, there was also Rose Moore, who spoke with Joe at the mall the night that Yvonne was killed. Rose also testified at trial. She testified that when she saw Joe, he was wearing a Nike outfit that was part white and part some other color. She also testified that he had a knife, but she was vague about what kind of knife it was. Rose testified that the clothes he was wearing were consistent with the pants the police recovered. She also testified that Joe wrote his name and number on the back of a card. And she testified that after they left the mall, she saw Joe walking on the side of the road. Now, on cross-examination, the defense pointed out that it took months for Rose to go to the police. She was also confronted with her statement to the police. In that statement, she said that Joe's pants were white. In her testimony at trial, she said they were black. Rose explained that she said white because she remembered the pants having white on them. She was also confronted about saying to the police that the knife had a sheath, whereas it did not. There are other inconsistencies in Rose's statements. According to the report written on the statement, Moore said that the knife was an 8 to 10-inch hunting knife in a sheath. She said, quote, "It looked like a hunting knife to me. It wasn't a pocket knife. It was bigger than that." So this is all presented, by the way, to the jury. All of these inconsistencies are brought up by cross-examination, the defense counsel, which he does a good job. Really, his job is to poke holes into what she is saying to the jury that day by showing how she has been inconsistent. Why would Rose lie? The defense is trying to say that she's being coached by the police or the prosecution to say a story that fits with the evidence that the prosecution has. But here's the thing. The jury had all of this to consider.
Yeah, the jury had everything to consider. And look, I get it. the knife that Rose describes to the police is not the knife Joe had at all. Joe had basically a folding knife, a small knife. It certainly wasn't 8 to 10 inches long. We're going to talk about the knives in this case next week, and we're going to go through how the knife that Joe had doesn't really seem like it could have been the murder weapon. This knife that Rose is describing would have been much more likely to have caused the wounds we're going to see. But there's the other side of this, and that's Rose is describing a knife that she saw months before. Maybe at the time she didn't really think about it. It's grown. It's sort of like the fish story, right? So this knife, that was a pretty small knife, by the time she knows there's been this vicious murder, it becomes this big hunting knife in a sheath, a really scary knife to commit a really scary crime. If the police are coaching her, they did a really, really crappy job. It's hard for me to be on the side of the police are coaching Rose about what to say in her initial statement, and yet they gave her all the wrong information. You know, she's coming out with this hunting knife and this sheath and everything else, and it's like, that's not what they want to hear. They want to hear it's this other knife, right? So it's hard for me to buy the coaching story. The other problem is the police would have been really foolish to coach her on what kind of knife it was, because they didn't know about Joe until at this point. They did not know about Joe when Rose walks in that door. Rose is one of the people who points them to Joe, so they wouldn't have even known about this knife. They wouldn't know what it looked like. So for them to coach her about what to say about a knife, and then they're going to find a completely different knife, that's like the worst frame-up job ever. You know, like if they were going to have her say it was a hunting knife in a sheath, and then they were going to plant that knife, why didn't they do that? You know, the hunting knife never shows up, right? The knife that shows up is the knife that Joe bought that night, that we know he bought. He absolutely bought that knife, and that knife absolutely ends up in the storm drain somehow. So the coaching thing, it just doesn't work for me. Maybe Rose is just completely making this up out of whole cloth because she wants to be important, or she doesn't like Joe or something. I mean, maybe you can come up with a reason she would just fabricate this entirely, but the police coaching her thing, it just doesn't fit.
And that's a great point, Brett. And this is why we care about timelines. That's why we have a timeline in every one of our cases, because it's very easy to kind of mush everything together and say, oh, it's obvious that Rose was coached, but not if you look at the timeline of what the police knew when, how they could even possibly coach her. It doesn't make any sense with respect to Rose's testimony. It may just be that she doesn't know knives well, or she couldn't remember exactly what she had seen or spoken about that night because it had been some time since she spoke with Joe. And it was really a brief encounter. It sounds like they spoke for just a few minutes, and it was not noteworthy at the time. It wasn't until later that encounter became noteworthy.
And of course, it wasn't just Rose. It was also her boyfriend, Chris Campbell. Chris testified that he was there with Rose and they saw Joe in the mall that day. He says he was sitting in the food court. He notices he's staring at him. He looks familiar. Now, he was surprised. One of the reasons this stuck in Chris's head was because he had never seen Joe in clothes like he was wearing. Expensive Nike gear is how he described it. And he testified that after he learned that Yvonne had been murdered, he knew Joe had done it because of what Joe had told him. But he didn't say anything because he didn't want to be a snitch. In fact, he had told Rose to stay out of it, that there was no reason to talk to the police about this, that if Joe had killed one person, he could kill somebody else. But Rose was absolutely insistent. Her conscience would not let her stay silent, and she insisted on going to the police. And if it hadn't been for her essentially forcing him to go, he would have stayed out of it.
Now, this might sound strange to some of you when you think, well, if someone knows that, who the murderer is, why would they not go to the police, or why would they not try to seek some justice for Yvonne? We see this very often. People are very reticent to speak to us, even if they can bring justice for someone or get someone dangerous off the streets. They think, you know what? Street justice. I don't want to be part of any legal process. I don't want to have to testify in court. I don't want to have to talk to police. You guys stay out of my life. I will stay out of this. This has nothing to do with me. And so I know upon first glance, I even think that there's no way. If he knew that Joe did it, he would go to the police. But our real life experience is that oftentimes people just want to stay out of it. They don't want to get involved with the police or the litigation process.
100%.
In fact, I think we see this in the Maura Murray case. A lot of the neighbors at the crash site, they've kind of been battered with, true crime armchair detectives, as well as, journalists and people who want to do stories on it. And I think they're really sick and tired of being a part of the story. And people think, why wouldn't they want to talk to people? It's exhausting. And it honestly is exhausting to be one of our witnesses, Brett.
No, 100%. And I absolutely can understand why you wouldn't want to be involved. And it's one of the reasons we beat the drum so often that there are people out there who know things. In all these cases, in all these unsolved cases we have, there are people like Chris and Rose who don't ever go to the police because they don't want to be involved, or they're scared, or they don't want to have their life turned upside down, or they have their own criminal issues they don't want the police to know about. Happens all the time. And it's why a lot of these cases stay unsolved. And you can imagine, if it really is true that the police did not really think anything about, they didn't know Joe, didn't know he might be involved. Apparently, if you listen to Murder and Alliance, the police at one point go talk to a psychic. And while they're talking to the psychic, they actually talk about David, and they say they don't think he's involved. They don't think he did it. And if that's true, then the police, they're looking in a different direction. And it wasn't until Rose and Chris come in and say, this guy named Joe said he killed her, and then they talk to Joe, and he says David did it. If it hadn't been for that, if Rose and Chris had kept their mouths shut, maybe this is just an unsolved mystery. It's a case we talk about, and we wonder who did it, and we're talking about how somebody knows something, and absolutely, they did, and they just never talked. But in this case, they did talk, and that's how this ended up happening, if they're telling the truth. So we're going to keep walking through this case. We're going to leave you for now. We'll be back next week with more stuff. Next week, we've talked about the statement and we've talked about the testimony of various people that seem to back up the statement, whether it's the people that Joe was staying with at the time, Rose and Chris, Sam. Next week, we're going to talk more about sort of the physical evidence in this case and whether or not the physical evidence fits with what Joe says. And I'll just go ahead and give you a little spoiler. There's a lot of it that doesn't. And this case is sort of endlessly twisting and turning, because just when you think you kind of got an idea about what's going on, you start looking at different things, and all of a sudden you have new questions. So really interested to hear what you guys think so far. Shoot us an email at prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for all your various social media. Join us on Patreon. Leave a review on Apple. And most importantly, tell your friends. As we said at the beginning of this episode, you are the reason that we have had 2 million listens, and you'll be the reason we have 2 million more. So thank you for all your support that you give to this podcast.
We love you guys. Thank you so much. And come back next time as we hopefully wrap up this case.
Hopefully. We'll do our best to wrap this one up next time. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. And I'm joined, as always, by my impeccable co-host. Sorry.
That is not good when you can't even say it with a straight face, because you know that's not true. Wow.
It's true. Let me start over. Hold on.
You can't laugh. You know what? That's like, you can't even say it with a straight face. That's terrible.
Okay, here we go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of...
What? Stop it! Is it that funny to think I'm impeccable? You know what? It's been a great...
It's just, you start laughing.
It's been a great day today. I think we should call it a night because we hit 2 million listens. Woo!
There you go. Okay, here we go.
Is it just because you missed it?
It is.
Yeah, with me this weekend.
If you're looking to streamline your audio advertising buys and maximize your revenue, look no further than Triton Digital's programmatic audio advertising exchange, A2X. The private exchange consists of only licensed broadcasters and top-tier internet radio publishers, assuring the quality inventory and brand safety you can trust. Visit www.tritondigital.com to learn more.